Hello everybody, Roddy here with Matthew talking about the whiskies that we had on tasting just over the weekend there on Friday and Saturday. So
we started off with this little brown dog, North British, 32-year-old from 1992, which was delicious. We then followed that with the Benrinnes, which we'll talk about in a second. And we had this Ardnamurchan Madeira cask, which was delicious, especially the longer it was in the glass. Followed that up with Mortlach from Signatory, which was very, very good. And
the 99-1.
99-1, which we'll talk about in a second. And Kilchoman 13-year-old, which was lovely as well. But we're going to talk a wee bit about two of the drams that we tasted.
So the first one we're going to talk about is the Lady of the Glen Benrinnes, which is an 11-year-old.
That was my dram of the night, I think.
From a first fill bourbon barrel. One of the themes of the tasting was the process of distillation, because Mortlach is famously 2.5 times distilled. Benrinnes for a while was also running partial triple distillation, but as Matthew, you were saying on the tasting, they've reverted to the normal 2 double distillation, but they've managed to maintain a really characterful malt.
It's the amount of fruit you get in the spirit, which is just remarkable, I think. And I was commenting on the fact that in the previous distilling regime, I always felt that it kind of reached the fruitiness started really revealing itself once it hit kind of 12, 15, 18 years. Much below that, then it would often be a wee bit too, it would show its youth too readily, whereas this new distilling regime, the fruit really leaps out at a much younger age. And I think particularly this bottling gives you that in spades. It's just fruit, first fill bourbons, that adds to that kind of brightness in the glass. And it's certainly a whiskey that is, with water, you just reveal layers and layers and layers of flavour. Yeah, an absolute belter. If you want to know what Benrinnes can be like, this is such a great example of it.
A lovely dram. Right. And then the second whiskey that we're talking about today is this interesting blend called 99-1, which is bottled by Living Souls. So they're a fairly new Glasgow bottler, Living Souls. We've had a few of their products since the launch, and this was another one of the big hits on Friday and Saturday. This is a whiskey with no age statement. It's a blended whiskey, but the label does tell us that it's a very unusual blend in that it's a malt whiskey that has accidentally had a little bit of grain whiskey introduced into it, so it punches very, very much above its weight. It's much older than its no age statement suggests it might be. It's certainly not as young as it has to be. It's a lovely mature dram.
Yeah, absolutely. I think technically this would be a 3-year-old whiskey. But the 3-year-old aspect of this is homeopathic levels in amongst a much greater amount of 18-year-old malt, which is the balance of what's left. Bottled at 46.3%, which might reveal a wee bit about one of the whiskies that's in it.
Something of a clue.
You just need to mull that one over.
If you like a sherried, smoky, mature whiskey to sip on, then this would be the one to go for. But this is kind of typical of the sort of what we're aiming for in our whiskey tastings, that we've got a variety of drams, both official bottlings and independent bottlings, covering a range of styles. So if you haven't been to one of them, either in person or virtual, then give it a go.
Absolutely, always good fun.
Yes.
Cheers, folks.
Cheers.